The sirens cut through the October rain like scissors through silk. Emily Carter stood at the window of her third-floor apartment on Amsterdam Avenue, watching red and blue lights paint the wet pavement below in violent streaks. Her hands trembled around the ceramic mug her daughter had made in second grade. Uneven, lopsided, covered in handprints that were now 4 years old. The coffee inside had gone cold an hour ago. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She wasn't supposed to be here. At 42, she should have been at the community center on 114th Street, leading the Tuesday night book club she'd founded 6 years ago when her husband left and she needed something, anything, to fill the silence. Instead, she stood frozen, watching officers in rain-slicked jackets emerge from patrol cars, their faces grim and purposeful in a way that made her stomach twist. The knock came at 9:47 p.m., 3 sharp raps that seemed to shake the entire doorframe. Emily set down the mug carefully on the windowsill, next to the succulent plant her neighbor Mrs. Chen had given her last spring. The plant was thriving despite her neglect, sending up new shoots that reached toward the streetlight glow. She'd never been good at keeping things alive, but somehow this stubborn little thing refused to die. "Ms. Carter? NYPD. We need to speak with you." Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood as she crossed the small living room. The apartment still smelled like the chicken soup she'd made on Sunday, though it was Wednesday now and she'd eaten nothing but crackers since then. The walls were covered with photographs. Her daughter Maya at every age, gaps showing where Daniel's pictures used to hang before she'd taken them down in a fury of heartbreak and red wine. She opened the door to find Detective Margaret Rodriguez and a younger officer she didn't recognize. Rodriguez was a familiar face in the neighborhood, someone who'd spoken at the community safety meetings Emily organized every month. He'd always been kind, patient, the type of cop who remembered names and asked about people's grandchildren. Tonight, his eyes held something different. Regret, maybe, or pity. "Emily," he said, and the use of her first name made her knees weak. "May we come in?" She stepped aside, and they entered like mourners at a funeral, removing their caps, water dripping onto her welcome mat. The younger officer, his nameplate read Sullivan, glanced around the apartment with the quick, cataloging gaze of someone trained to notice details. Emily wondered what he saw. The stack of ungraded papers on the dining table, evidence of her job as a 5th-grade teacher at PS 165. The worn couch where she'd cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count. The bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks and library books, her only reliable companions. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, because that's what you did when people came to your home, even when their presence felt like the end of something. "No, thank you." Rodriguez's voice was gentle. "Emily, I need you to sit down." She perched on the edge of the couch, her fingers finding a loose thread in the armrest and pulling at it. Through the window, she could see more cars arriving. The street was transforming into a crime scene, though she couldn't imagine what crime. This was a quiet block, full of families and elderly couples who'd lived here since the 70s. The biggest excitement they'd had in months was when Mr. Petrov's cat got stuck in the oak tree and the fire department had to come. "There's been a development," Rodriguez continued, sitting across from her in the armchair that had been Daniel's favorite, "regarding the disappearance of Thomas Webb." The name hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Webb. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in months, though it lived in her mind like a ghost, haunting the edges of every quiet moment. Thomas had been her student 2 years ago, a bright, shy boy with glasses that were always slightly crooked and a smile that could light up a room when he forgot to be self-conscious. He disappeared on a Tuesday in March, walking home from school through Riverside Park. One moment he was there, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, humming a tune from music class. The next, he was gone. The search had consumed the neighborhood for weeks. Flyers on every lamppost, his face staring out from newscasts, volunteers combing the park until their voices went hoarse calling his name. Emily had joined every search party, walked every street until her feet bled, stayed up nights thinking about all the what-ifs and maybes. They never found him. After 6 months, the police presence dwindled. The news moved on to other tragedies. The flyers faded in the rain and sun until Thomas's face was barely visible, a ghost of ink on weathered paper. His mother, Patricia Webb, had stopped coming to the community meetings. The last time Emily saw her, she'd aged 20 years and 6 months. Her eyes hollow and distant, moving through the world like someone already dead. "We found him," Rodriguez said, and Emily's heart leaped with a hope so fierce it hurt. But then she saw his face, the careful way he was watching her, and the hope curdled into something cold and terrible. "Where?" The word came out as a whisper. "In the basement of a building on 107th Street. Emily." He paused, and in that pause, she understood that whatever came next would change everything. "We've made an arrest." "Who?" She was on her feet now, though she didn't remember standing. "Who did this? Who took him?" Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Sullivan, and in that silent communication, Emily felt the foundation of her world begin to crack. "Emily, we need to ask you some questions about your relationship with your neighbor, Mrs. Margaret Chen." The words didn't make sense. She repeated them in her mind, trying to arrange them into an order that had meaning. Mrs. Chen, her neighbor, the elderly woman who brought her soup when she was sick, who watered her plants when she traveled, who'd lived in the apartment next door for 30 years and knew everyone on the block. "Margaret." Emily's voice sounded strange, distant. "What does Margaret have to do with Thomas?" But even as she asked, pieces were clicking together in her mind like a puzzle she didn't want to solve. The basement apartment Margaret had mentioned, the one she rented out for extra income. The way she'd been so invested in the search, always asking questions, always wanting to know what the police were doing. The kindness that now, in this new terrible light, looked like something else entirely. "No," Emily said, backing away. "No, that's not possible. You don't know her. She's been here for decades. She volunteers at the library. She makes cookies for the block parties. She's Margaret." "Ms. Carter," Sullivan spoke for the first time, his voice young and uncertain. "We need you to come down to the station and give a statement. You may have information that could help us understand." "Understand what?" Emily's voice rose, cracking. "You think Margaret Chen kidnapped Thomas Webb? That's insane. She's 73 years old. She has arthritis. She can barely carry her groceries upstairs." Rodriguez stood slowly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Emily, I know this is a shock, but we have evidence. Physical evidence that places Thomas in the basement apartment of 452 Amsterdam Avenue, Apartment B. That property is owned by Margaret Chen." The room tilted. Emily reached for the wall to steady herself, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Margaret over the past 2 years. Every cup of tea shared at her kitchen table. Every casual conversation in the hallway. Every time Margaret had asked about her day, her students, her life. The succulent plant on the windowsill seemed to mock her now, thriving with its stubborn life. A gift from a woman who might be a monster. "I need to see her," Emily said. "I need to talk to her. There has to be an explanation." "That's not possible right now," Rodriguez said gently. "She's been taken into custody. Emily, please, come with us. Help us understand what you might have seen, what you might know." Through the window, Emily watched as officers led someone out of the building. Even from 3 floors up, even in the rain and the chaos of lights, she recognized the small, hunched figure. Margaret Chen, wearing her blue cardigan and sensible shoes, her white hair plastered to her head by the rain. She looked so small between the officers, so fragile and ordinary. And that was the thing that made Emily's blood run cold. The absolute ordinariness of it all. Evil wasn't supposed to look like a 73-year-old woman who baked snickerdoodles and watched Jeopardy every night. It wasn't supposed to live next door, sharing walls and pleasantries and the occasional cup of sugar. Emily picked up the ceramic mug from the windowsill, Maya's handprints forever preserved in glazed clay. She thought about Thomas Webb, about his mother's hollow eyes, about all the nights she'd wondered what had happened to that bright, shy boy. And she thought about Margaret Chen, who'd given her this plant, who'd sat in her living room just last week talking about the weather and the new bodega on the corner, whose life had been as familiar and unremarkable as the changing seasons. "What evidence?" Emily asked quietly, still staring out the window. "What did you find?" Rodriguez was silent for a moment. Then his backpack, some of his clothes. "And, Emily, he's alive. Thomas is alive." The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, coffee and ceramics spreading across the hardwood in a pattern like a constellation. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Amsterdam Avenue, washing away nothing, revealing everything. The police station at the 24th precinct smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, a combination that made Emily's stomach churn. She sat in a small interview room with beige walls and a table scarred with scratches, each one telling a story she didn't want to imagine. A camera blinked red in the corner, recording everything, reducing her shock and confusion to digital data. Detective Rodriguez sat across from her, a legal pad open in front of him, though he hadn't written anything yet. Sullivan stood by the door like a sentinel, his young face carefully neutral. "Tell me about your relationship with Margaret Chen," Rodriguez said. "Start from the beginning." Emily wrapped her hands around the cup of water they'd given her, though she hadn't taken a sip. Where was the beginning? When Margaret had welcomed her to the building 7 years ago with a homemade apple pie. When she'd helped Emily carry boxes up the stairs on moving day, chattering about the neighborhood and its history. When she'd sat with her through those first terrible nights after Daniel left, not offering platitudes, just presence. "She's my neighbor," Emily said, and the words felt inadequate, too small to contain the complicated truth. "She's been my friend." "How often did you see her?" "Almost every day. She'd knock on my door around 7 in the evening, just to check in. Sometimes we'd have tea. She'd tell me stories about the neighborhood in the old days when it was different. More dangerous, she used to say. She'd lived through all the changes, the crack epidemic in the 80s, the gentrification in the 90s. She'd seen everything." Emily paused, remembering Margaret's voice, the slight accent that revealed her childhood in Taiwan, the way she'd laugh at her own jokes. "She was lonely, I think. Her husband died 15 years ago. They never had children. I suppose I was like a daughter to her in some ways." "And your daughter, Maya, did she spend time with Mrs. Chen?" The question made Emily's chest tighten. "Yes. Margaret would babysit sometimes when I had parent-teacher conferences or evening meetings. Maya loved her. She called her Grandma Maggie." She saw Rodriguez and Sullivan exchange another look, and anger flared hot in her chest. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't you dare suggest that my daughter was in danger. Margaret would never." "We're not suggesting anything," Rodriguez interrupted gently. "We're just trying to understand the full picture." "Emily, did Margaret ever mention the basement apartment?" Emily forced herself to think past the emotion, to remember. She rented it out sometimes, for extra income. Her pension wasn't much and the building expenses kept going up. She'd complain about it sometimes, the cost of repairs, property taxes. I offered to help her find renters a few times, put up ads at school, but she always said she preferred to handle it herself. "Did you ever see who rented the apartment?" "No." She said it was mostly short-term people. Students, artists needing studio space, that sort of thing. The entrance is separate, around the back of the building. You wouldn't see them unless you specifically went looking. Emily's mind was racing now, connecting dots she didn't want to connect. The basement apartment with its separate entrance, invisible to the rest of the building. Margaret's insistence on privacy, her careful management of who came and went. Had it all been calculated? Had every kindness been a mask? In the months after Thomas disappeared, Rodriguez continued, "Did you notice any changes in Mrs. Chen's behavior?" Emily closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that terrible spring. She'd been so consumed by the search, by her grief for Thomas and his family, that everything else had blurred into background noise. But now, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, she remembered. Margaret had been there constantly, always offering help, always asking about the investigation, about what the police were doing, about where they'd searched. She joined the search parties, walking through Riverside Park with her cane, calling Thomas's name alongside everyone else. At the time, Emily had thought it was compassion, community spirit. Now it looked like something else. Monitoring, controlling the narrative, making sure she knew everything the searchers knew. She was very involved in the search, Emily said slowly. More than most people. I remember thinking it was kind of her, given her age and her arthritis. She didn't have to spend hours walking through the park, but she did. Did she ever seem nervous? Anxious? We were all anxious. A child was missing. Emily's voice cracked. But no, I don't remember her being particularly different. She was Margaret. Calm, practical, always ready with tea and sympathy. Rodriguez wrote something on his pad, and Emily felt a wave of unreality wash over her. This couldn't be happening. Margaret Chen couldn't be sitting in a cell somewhere, arrested for kidnapping. Thomas Webb couldn't have been in the basement apartment this whole time, just one building away, while they searched the entire city. I need you to tell me about Thomas, Rodriguez said. About your relationship with him as his teacher. Emily's throat constricted. Thomas. God, Thomas. She tried so hard not to think about him too specifically over the past months, because the grief and guilt were too much to bear. But now she let herself remember. He was special, she began, her voice soft, quiet but brilliant. He loved reading more than anything. During free period, he'd sit in the corner with a book, completely absorbed. Fantasy mostly, Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia, anything with magic and adventure. He said reality was boring, and he wanted to live somewhere more interesting. A tear tracked down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. He had trouble making friends. The other kids thought he was weird, too quiet, too bookish. He'd eat lunch alone most days, reading. I tried to help, tried to encourage the other students to include him, but you can't force friendship. Did he ever talk about problems at home? No. His mother Patricia was wonderful. Single parent, working 2 jobs, but she made time for him. She'd come to every parent-teacher conference, always asking what more she could do to support his education. They had a good relationship, as far as I could tell. Emily paused, remembering something. There was one thing. About a month before he disappeared, Thomas started staying after school more often. He said he didn't want to go home right away. I asked if everything was okay, and he said yes, but I don't know. I got the feeling something was bothering him. Did you report this to anyone? I mentioned it to Patricia. She said she'd talk to him, but that he'd been moody lately. Typical 10-year-old stuff, she thought. And then, Emily's voice broke. And then he was gone, and I spent months wondering if I'd missed something, if there was a sign I should have seen. She looked up at Rodriguez, and the question she'd been holding back finally burst out. Is he okay? Thomas, is he physically hurt? Rodriguez's expression softened. He's at the hospital now, being evaluated. I can't give you details, but, Emily, he's been living in that basement for 17 months. He's malnourished, psychologically traumatized. It's going to be a long road for him and his mother. 17 months. Emily did the math automatically, a teacher's habit. 17 months of being held in darkness while the world searched for him. 17 months of Margaret Chen living her normal life, having tea with Emily, going to the library, attending community meetings, all while a child was imprisoned in her basement. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. I don't understand, Emily whispered. Why? Why would she do this? That's what we're trying to figure out, Rodriguez said. Emily, I know this is hard, but I need you to think carefully. Did Margaret ever show unusual interest in Thomas specifically? Did she ever mention him? Emily's mind scrolled back through countless conversations, searching for red flags she'd missed. And then she remembered. The book fair, she said suddenly. Last year, in February, right before he disappeared, the school held a book fair, and Margaret volunteered to help. I didn't think anything of it. Lots of community members volunteer. But I remember seeing her talking to Thomas. They were discussing books. He was showing her his favorite series, and she was listening so intently, asking him questions. Emily's hands were shaking now. I remember thinking how sweet it was, how good she was with him. He was smiling, animated in a way I rarely saw. She asked him what kind of magic he wished was real, and he said he wished he could disappear sometimes, go somewhere nobody could find him. It was just kid talk, fantasy. But she looked at him so strangely, and she said, sometimes disappearing is the only way to be safe. The memory, so innocent at the time, now felt sinister. Emily could see it clearly now. Margaret's interest, Thomas's lonely vulnerability, the perfect storm of predator and prey. After that, did you see them interact again? I don't know. Maybe in passing? Margaret walked through the neighborhood a lot. She could have seen him on his way to school at the park. I wasn't watching for that. The guilt crashed over her like a wave. She should have been watching. She should have protected him. She was his teacher, and she'd failed him in the most fundamental way possible. This isn't your fault, Rodriguez said, reading her expression. Emily, you couldn't have known. But she should have. That was the thing that would haunt her. All those evenings with Margaret, all those cups of tea and casual conversations, and she'd never suspected, never questioned, never saw past the mask of kindness to whatever darkness lay beneath. Can I ask you something? Emily said. The evidence you found, his backpack, his clothes. How could she have kept him there all this time without anyone knowing? The building isn't soundproofed. Someone should have heard something. Rodriguez hesitated. The basement apartment was modified. Reinforced walls, soundproofing installed years ago, supposedly for music practice. And Mrs. Chen was clever. She maintained her normal routine perfectly. No one had any reason to suspect her. Emily thought about the building, the way sound traveled through the old walls. She could hear Mr. Petrov's television through her ceiling, could hear the couple on the first floor arguing. But she'd never heard anything from the basement. Never even thought about what might be happening down there. What happens now? She asked. We continue investigating. Build our case. There will likely be a trial, and you may be called to testify about your relationship with Mrs. Chen, about what you observed. The thought of testifying, of facing Margaret in a courtroom, made Emily feel sick. But she would do it. For Thomas. For Patricia. For every moment of false friendship and calculated deception. Rodriguez stood, signaling the end of the interview. You can go home. But Emily, the media is going to be all over this story. A beloved community member arrested for kidnapping? There's going to be chaos. You might want to prepare yourself. As if she could prepare for something like this. As if there was any way to be ready for the moment when your entire understanding of someone shattered like glass. Sullivan escorted her out of the precinct. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the streetlights. It was past midnight now, and the city had that strange, suspended quality it sometimes got in the small hours, caught between the end of one day and the beginning of another. Emily walked home slowly, her mind churning. She thought about Maya, safe with her father this week. Thank God. She'd have to tell her somehow. Explain why Grandma Maggie wouldn't be around anymore. Why the nice old lady next door was actually a monster. She thought about Patricia Webb, who would get her son back but would never get back the person he used to be. 17 months of trauma couldn't be erased. That bright, shy boy who loved books and magic was gone. Replaced by someone else. Someone shaped by horror and captivity. And she thought about Margaret Chen, who she trusted, who she'd loved in the complicated way you love the people who become your family by choice rather than blood. Had any of it been real? The late-night conversations, the shared grief over Daniel's leaving, the quiet companionship of two lonely women finding solace in each other? Or had it all been manipulation? A long game played by someone who knew exactly how to make people trust her, how to hide in plain sight behind a mask of normalcy and kindness. Emily reached her building and stood outside, looking up at the dark windows. The crime scene tape was gone now, but the memory of those flashing lights remained, burned into her retinas. Everything looked the same brick facade, the same oak tree, the same worn steps, but nothing would ever be the same again. She climbed the stairs slowly, her keys jingling in the silence. When she reached the third floor, she paused outside her door, looking down the hallway to Margaret's apartment. The door was closed, sealed with police tape, a barrier between her and the truth of who her neighbor really was. Inside her own apartment, Emily stood in the darkness for a long time, not turning on the lights. The succulent plant on the windowsill was just a shadow, but she could feel its presence, that stubborn, thriving life. Tomorrow she would throw it away, she decided. She couldn't keep anything that connected her to Margaret Chen. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. The connections couldn't be severed so easily. Margaret was woven into the fabric of her life here, into her memories and her sense of this place as home. Removing her would be like trying to remove threads from a tapestry. The whole thing would unravel. Emily sat on the couch in the darkness, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally let herself cry. For Thomas, for Patricia, for the innocence of trusting your neighbors and believing in the fundamental goodness of people. For the version of herself who'd lived in this apartment yesterday, who'd had no idea that evil could wear such an ordinary face. The city sounds filtered through her windows. Sirens in the distance, voices on the street, the eternal hum of New York refusing to sleep. Somewhere out there, Thomas Webb was in a hospital bed, trying to remember what daylight felt like. Somewhere out there, Margaret Chen sat in a cell, either drowning in guilt or, more terrifyingly, feeling nothing at all. And here, in this small apartment on Amsterdam Avenue, Emily Carter sat in the wreckage of everything she'd thought she knew, trying to figure out how to move forward when the ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. The clock on the wall ticked toward morning, each second carrying her further from the person she'd been before those 3 sharp knocks on her door, before the revelation that had changed everything. She would survive this, she told herself. She had to, for Maya, who would need her strength, for her students, who would have questions she couldn't answer, for herself, because the alternative was to let the darkness win. But sitting there in the shadows, Emily couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face, kind and familiar, twisted now into something she didn't recognize, and she couldn't stop wondering. How many other monsters were hiding behind ordinary faces, waiting in the margins of normal life, patient as spiders in their webs? The morning came too soon and brought chaos with it. Emily woke on the couch, her neck cramped from sleeping at an angle, to the sound of reporters shouting questions outside her building. She stumbled to the window and looked down to see news vans lining the street, cameras pointed at the entrance like weapons, journalists jostling for position. Her phone had died sometime in the night. When she plugged it in, it exploded with notifications. Texts, calls, voicemails from people she hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know if the reports were true, if she'd really been neighbors with the woman who'd kidnapped Thomas Webb. The first call she returned was to her principal, Linda Okonkwo, who answered on the first ring. "Emily, thank God. Are you okay?" "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "Linda, I can't come in today. The press is everywhere, and I haven't slept. And, of course not. Take all the time you need. The district is sending a counselor to talk to the students about what happened. Some of them are old enough to remember Thomas, and they're going to have questions." Emily closed her eyes. Her students. She hadn't even thought about how this would affect them. "I should be there. I should help explain." "You need to take care of yourself first," Linda said firmly. "Emily, this is going to be a media circus. Your connection to Margaret Chen, the fact that Thomas was your student, they're going to want to make you part of the story. Do you have a lawyer?" "A lawyer? Why would I need—" Emily stopped, understanding hitting her like cold water. Of course. She'd been Margaret's friend, her confidant. She'd had access to the building, could have known about the basement apartment. To an outside observer, her ignorance might look like complicity. "Just as a precaution," Linda said, hearing Emily's panic. "You haven't done anything wrong, but you need someone to help you navigate this. I can give you some names." A sharp knock interrupted them. Emily moved to the door and looked through the peephole to see Mr. Petrov from upstairs. His weathered face creased with concern. "I have to go," Emily told Linda. "I'll call you later." She opened the door to find Mr. Petrov holding a container of what smelled like borscht. He was 84, a retired engineer who'd emigrated from Russia in the 70s, and in the 3 years Emily had lived here, They developed an easy friendship based on hallway conversations and his occasional gifts of food. "I saw the news," he said without preamble, thrusting the container at her. "Thought you might not feel like cooking." Emily accepted it, tears pricking her eyes at the simple kindness. "Thank you, Victor. That's very sweet." He shifted uncomfortably, his thick eyebrows drawn together. "I should have seen something. I lived above her for 20 years. How could I not know?" "None of us knew," Emily said softly. "That's the point, isn't it? She made sure we didn't know." Victor shook his head slowly. "I remember when her husband died. 15 years ago, heart attack, very sudden. She was devastated. I helped her with the funeral arrangements, carried groceries when she was too sad to leave the apartment. She seemed so broken, like a woman who'd lost everything." He paused, looking down the hallway toward Margaret's sealed door. "Makes you wonder if you ever really know anyone, if we're all just strangers pretending." After he left, Emily tried to eat the borscht but couldn't stomach it. She showered instead, standing under water hot enough to hurt, trying to wash away the feeling of contamination, of having been close to something evil without recognizing it. The water couldn't cleanse what she was feeling. Guilt, anger, betrayal, fear. They all swirled together into something nauseating and overwhelming. Her phone rang again. Daniel, her ex-husband. She almost didn't answer, but he'd have seen the news, and Maya was with him this week. She needed to talk to him about how to handle this with their daughter. Jesus Christ, are you okay?" Hearing his voice, still so familiar despite 3 years of divorce, nearly broke her composure. "I don't know how to explain this to Maya," she said. "How do I tell a 10-year-old that the woman she called Grandma Maggie is a kidnapper?" "You don't," Daniel said immediately. "Not yet. She doesn't need to know all the details. We'll tell her that Mrs. Chen did something bad and is in trouble with the police, that she won't be around anymore. That's enough for now. She's going to see it on the news. Kids at school are going to talk. Then I'll keep her home for a few days. Listen to me. This isn't your fault. You couldn't have known." Everyone kept saying that, but it didn't help. Emily had built her entire career on paying attention, on seeing the signs that children were in trouble, on being the adult who noticed and intervened. And she'd lived next door to a kidnapper for 2 years without seeing a single red flag. "I'm going to bring Maya to my parents' place in Connecticut for the week," Daniel continued. "Get her away from the media circus. You should think about leaving too, at least until this dies down." But Emily couldn't leave. This was her home, her neighborhood. Running away would feel like admitting guilt, like accepting that she'd been part of something monstrous. After hanging up with Daniel, she forced herself to look at the news coverage on her laptop. Every channel was running the story, and the narrative was already taking shape. Elderly woman, pillar of the community, hiding a horrific secret. They showed old photos of Margaret at block parties, smiling and ordinary. They showed the building, the basement entrance, the street Emily walked every day. And they mentioned her. Emily Carter, neighbor and friend of the accused, teacher of the victim. One reporter noted that she'd been very close to Margaret Chen, implying something Emily couldn't quite name but felt in her gut as accusation. The comments sections were even worse. Armchair detectives dissecting every detail, conspiracy theorists suggesting Emily must have known, must have been involved somehow. How could she not have noticed? How could she have been so blind? Emily slammed the laptop closed and tried to breathe through the rising panic. By afternoon, her small apartment felt like a prison. She needed to move, to do something, to feel less helpless. Against her better judgment, she decided to go to the hospital where Thomas was being treated. She told herself she just wanted to check on him, but deep down, she knew it was more complicated than that. She needed to see him, to verify with her own eyes that he was real, that he'd survived. The media was still outside her building, so she left through the back entrance, pulling up her hood and keeping her head down. The October air was crisp and cool, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and roasting chestnuts from a street vendor's cart. Normal city smells on a day that was anything but normal. New York Presbyterian was a 20-minute walk. Emily had visited this hospital before, when her mother was dying of cancer 5 years ago. The familiar antiseptic smell hit her as soon as she entered, triggering memories she'd worked hard to suppress. The woman at the information desk looked harried, dealing with what appeared to be a crowd of reporters trying to get information about Thomas Webb. Emily waited until the desk cleared, then approached. "I'm here to see Thomas Webb," she said quietly. "I'm his former teacher." The woman's expression shifted to something between sympathy and suspicion. "Room 412. But he's only allowed family visitors right now." Emily nodded and turned away, not surprised. She'd expected as much. But as she moved toward the elevators, she saw someone she recognized sitting in the waiting area. Patricia Webb looked like a ghost of herself, thinner than Emily remembered. Her dark hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there 17 months ago. She wore jeans and an oversized Columbia sweatshirt, and she was crying silently, tears streaming down her face while she stared at nothing. Emily's first instinct was to leave, to not intrude on this private grief. But then Patricia looked up, and their eyes met, and there was no avoiding it. "Ms. Carter," Patricia said, her voice hoarse. "I heard you were the one that the police talked to you first." Emily sat down carefully in the chair beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm so sorry, Patricia. I can't imagine what you're going through." Patricia laughed, a bitter sound. "Can't you? You knew her. You were friends with her. How could you not see what she was?" The accusation was direct, and Emily felt it like a knife. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've asked myself that same question 1,000 times since last night. I should have seen something. I should have known. She seemed so nice," Patricia continued, as if Emily hadn't spoken. "At the search parties, she'd bring thermoses of hot chocolate, blankets for people who were cold. She'd tell me not to lose hope, that Thomas would come home. And the whole time she had him. The whole time, she knew exactly where he was." Patricia's voice was rising, drawing looks from other people in the waiting room. Emily wanted to comfort her but didn't know how. What comfort could she possibly offer? "Is he okay?" Emily asked quietly. "I mean, I know he's not okay, but he doesn't remember everything," Patricia said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Or maybe he does and he's blocking it out. The psychologists say that's common. But what he does remember." She closed her eyes. She kept him in the dark most of the time, fed him sporadically, told him his family didn't want him anymore, that he was safer with her. She made him call her grandmother. Emily felt bile rise in her throat. The woman who'd sat in her living room, who'd listened to her problems and offered advice, had been systematically torturing a child. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "She's sick," Emily said. "She has to be mentally ill. No sane person could." "I don't care if she's sick," Patricia snapped. "I don't care about her trauma or her psychology or whatever excuse the lawyers come up with. She stole my son. She stole 17 months of his childhood. She made him afraid of sunlight and human contact. She broke him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Patricia was right, of course. Margaret's motivations didn't matter. The damage was done. "I'm sorry," Emily said again, knowing it was inadequate. "If there's anything I can do." "There isn't." Patricia stood abruptly. "I need to get back to him. He panics when I'm gone too long. Thinks I'm not coming back." She walked away without another word, leaving Emily alone in the waiting room, surrounded by the sick and worried, feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. Emily left the hospital and walked without direction, her feet carrying her through streets she'd walked thousands of times. The city was in full autumn glory, trees blazing with color, the light slanting golden through the buildings. It was beautiful, and she hated it for being beautiful when everything felt so broken. She found herself in Riverside Park, where Thomas had disappeared. The search parties had combed every inch of this ground, calling his name until their voices gave out. And all the while he'd been 3 blocks away, underground, in darkness. Emily sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, watching boats glide past, trying to process the magnitude of Margaret's deception. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated, methodical, Margaret had modified her basement apartment specifically for this purpose, had soundproofed it, had created a perfect prison. And then she'd watched the community tear itself apart searching for a boy she'd hidden in plain sight. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rodriguez. Need to talk. New information. Emily called him back immediately. What is it? Can you come to the station? It's better if we do this in person. 30 minutes later, she was back in the beige interview room, facing Rodriguez and a new detective, a woman named Sarah Park who introduced herself as specializing in crimes against children. We've been going through Margaret Chen's apartment, Park said without preamble. And we found something disturbing. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed a wall covered in pictures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Children. All of them young, all of them boys, all of them with similar features. Dark hair, glasses, shy smiles. Do you recognize any of these children? Park asked. Emily studied the photos, her heart sinking. Some of them are from my class. Current students, former students. That's Kevin Martinez, he's in 5th grade now. And that's James Okonkwo, principal's son. He graduated to middle school last year. And her hand trembled as she pointed. That's Thomas. Multiple photos of Thomas, from different angles, different times. We believe Chun was stalking multiple children, Park said, taking photos without their knowledge or consent. Thomas may not have been random. She may have been watching him for months, maybe years, planning this. The revelation made Emily's skin crawl. Margaret had walked through the neighborhood with her camera, playing the role of friendly elderly neighbor documenting community life. But really she'd been hunting, selecting targets, planning future crimes. There's more, Rodriguez said quietly. We found journals, detailed accounts of her observations, her thoughts about different children, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Emily, your daughter is mentioned. The world tilted sideways. What? Park pulled out a photocopy of a journal page, handwritten in Margaret's neat cursive. Emily forced herself to read it. Maya Carter, age 10. Lives with her mother 3 days a week, father 4 days. Quiet child like her mother. Loves to read. Stays after school on Tuesdays for art club. Walks home alone on Amsterdam, always takes the same route. Trusting. Emily trusts me with her. Could take her anytime. Emily was going to be sick. She bolted from the chair and barely made it to the trash can in the corner before vomiting. Park brought her water, waited patiently while she regained some composure. We believe you and your daughter were being groomed, Park said gently. Building trust with you gave her access to Maya. The babysitting, the neighborly relationship, it was all strategic. Emily wiped her mouth with a shaking hand. But she never. Maya is okay. She never touched her. Because she already had Thomas, Rodriguez said. Chun couldn't risk arousing suspicion by taking another child, especially one so close to home. But we think Maya might have been her backup plan, or perhaps her next target. The thought of what could have happened, what might have happened if Margaret hadn't already been occupied with Thomas, made Emily's blood run cold. Every time she'd left Maya with Margaret, every casual conversation, every moment of trust had been a potential tragedy averted only by luck. There are other children mentioned in the journals, Park continued. We're reaching out to all the families, making sure everyone's accounted for. But Emily, we need you to help us understand her patterns. You knew her better than almost anyone. How did she select Thomas? What made him vulnerable? Emily thought back to that moment at the book fair, to Thomas's confession that he sometimes wished he could disappear. Margaret had heard that and seen opportunity. She'd identified a lonely child, one who felt disconnected from the world, and she'd offered him what he thought he wanted. A disappearance, an escape. She was good at listening, Emily said slowly. Really listening in a way most people don't. She'd remember details from conversations weeks later. If you told her you were having a problem, she'd check in about it. It made you feel cared for, valued. And she used that information, Park said. Yes. Emily felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She knew I was lonely after my divorce. She knew Maya struggled with the separation. She knew Thomas felt isolated at school. She found the cracks in people's lives and inserted herself into them, made herself indispensable. It was a perfect predator strategy, Emily realized. Margaret hadn't lurked in shadows or relied on stranger danger. She'd hidden in community, in neighborliness, in the assumption that elderly women were safe and kind and trustworthy. How many others? Emily asked. How many children did she hurt before Thomas? Rodriguez and Park exchanged a look. We don't know yet, Rodriguez admitted. We're investigating. The journals go back years. There may have been others. The implications were staggering. This wasn't one crime. It was potentially dozens, spanning decades. Margaret Chen hadn't been a lonely widow who'd snapped. She'd been a serial predator, operating in plain sight for years. Emily left the police station as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty felt obscene. She walked home slowly, dreading the gauntlet of reporters, the questions she couldn't answer, the life that would never be the same. When she reached her building, a woman was waiting outside. Tall, elegant, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing a tailored suit that screamed expensive lawyer. Ms. Carter? I'm Diane Rothstein. I represent Margaret Chen. Emily stopped dead. I have nothing to say to you. I understand this is difficult, Rothstein said, her voice smooth and professional. But my client maintains her innocence, and I believe there may have been some misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Emily's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. Thomas Webb was in her basement for 17 months. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime. The evidence is circumstantial. The apartment is registered in her name, yes, but she rents it out. Anyone could have. Don't. Emily cut her off. Don't you dare try to make her the victim here. I know what she is. I've seen the journals, the photos. I know what she planned to do to my daughter. Rothstein's expression didn't change. You were close to my client. You understand she's not capable of this. She's 73 years old. For God's sake. A respected member of the community. The real perpetrator could still be out there. And by focusing solely on Margaret Chen, the police are letting them escape. It was a good strategy, Emily thought distantly. Plant doubt. Suggest a wider conspiracy. Make Margaret seem too old, too frail, too ordinary to be guilty. But Emily had spent too many years teaching children, learning to spot lies and manipulations. She recognized it when she saw it. Get away from my building, Emily said quietly, and tell your client that I hope she spends the rest of her life in prison. She pushed past Rothstein and into the building, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the door. Inside her apartment, Emily stood in the darkness again, too exhausted to turn on lights. The succulent plant on the windowsill seemed to glow in the moonlight, its leaves plump and healthy, thriving despite everything. She picked it up, intending to throw it in the trash, to rid herself of this last connection to Margaret Chen. But her hands wouldn't obey. Instead, she found herself watering it, her tears mixing with the water, falling onto the soil. Because the terrible truth was this: the plant was innocent. The gift, at the moment it was given, might even have been genuine. Margaret Chen wasn't a cartoon villain, all evil all the time. She was complex, contradictory, capable of small kindnesses even while planning horrors. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Evil didn't announce itself. It wore a friendly face. It brought you soup when you were sick and kept a child prisoner in the basement. It existed in the same person at the same time without apparent contradiction. Emily set the plant back on the windowsill and finally turned on the lights, facing her reflection in the window. She looked older than she had yesterday, worn down by revelation and grief, but she was still here, still standing, still trying to make sense of the senseless. Tomorrow she would call Maya, try to explain the unexplainable. Tomorrow she would face her students, her community, the long process of healing from a wound that went deeper than anyone yet understood. But tonight she would simply survive. One breath, then another, then another. It was all she could manage. It would have to be enough. The trial began in February, for months after Margaret Chen's arrest. Emily had hoped the intervening time would make things easier, But if anything, it had gotten worse. The media attention never died down. Every new revelation from the investigation sparked another round of coverage, another invasion of her privacy. They'd found evidence of 3 other children. Not in Margaret's basement. Those children had been released after shorter periods, their disappearances reported but never connected until now. The oldest case dated back 15 years, to shortly after Margaret's husband died. A pattern emerged of lonely boys, isolated children who Margaret had befriended and then taken, kept for weeks or months before releasing them with threats and trauma that kept them silent. Thomas had been her longest captive. The doctors theorized she'd been escalating, becoming bolder, holding him longer because she'd gotten away with it so many times before. Emily sat in the courtroom on the first day of the trial, positioned in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. She'd been called as a witness, would have to testify about her relationship with Margaret, about what she'd observed and failed to observe. The thought made her nauseous, but she'd agreed to do it. For Thomas. For the other victims. For Maya, who'd had nightmares for months after learning the truth. Margaret was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her white hair thin and uncombed, her face gaunt from months in jail. She looked every bit her 73 years, frail and small and almost pitiable. Emily felt a flash of the old affection, quickly followed by revulsion at herself for feeling it. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Margaret's expression was unreadable. Not defiant, not apologetic, just blank, empty, like looking at a stranger wearing Margaret's face. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Amanda Price, stood to deliver her opening statement. She was good, Emily had been told. Experienced with crimes against children, passionate about justice, the kind of lawyer who didn't lose often. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Price began, her voice clear and commanding. Over the next several weeks, you're going to hear a story that will disturb you. A story about a woman who used kindness as a weapon, community standing as camouflage, and trust as a tool for predation. She outlined the case methodically, the evidence, the timeline, the pattern of behavior spanning 15 years. She described the modified basement apartment with its soundproof walls and reinforced door. She detailed the journals, the photographs, the systematic stalking of vulnerable children. The defense will try to make you doubt, Price said. They'll point to Margaret Chen's age, her reputation, her lack of prior criminal history. They'll suggest that someone else could have used her apartment, that she was too old and frail to commit these crimes. But the evidence will show you otherwise. The evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Margaret Chen is exactly what she appears to be. A predator who spent decades perfecting her craft. Diane Rothstein, Margaret's lawyer, countered with a different narrative in her opening statement. She painted Margaret as a lonely widow, taken advantage of by renters who used her property for criminal purposes. She emphasized Margaret's age, her arthritis, her clean record. She suggested the police had tunnel vision, focusing on an easy target instead of looking for the real perpetrator. It was persuasive, Emily had to admit. If she didn't know better, she might have believed it. The prosecution's witnesses came first. Patricia Webb testified about her son's disappearance, breaking down on the stand as she described the 17 months of not knowing if he was alive or dead. The courtroom was silent except for her sobs, and several jurors were crying too. The other victims' families testified as well. A mother whose son had been taken for 6 weeks when he was 9, returned traumatized and silent, unable to speak about what had happened for years. A father whose 8-year-old had disappeared for 3 months, found wandering the streets one day with no explanation, later revealing in therapy that an old grandmother had kept him in a basement, telling him his parents didn't want him anymore. The pattern was consistent. Lonely children, offered kindness and attention, then imprisoned and psychologically tortured. Margaret had a type, and she'd been hunting that type for 15 years. On the 3rd day, Thomas testified. He was 12 now, taller than Emily remembered but painfully thin. His dark eyes wary and old beyond his years. He'd asked to testify despite the prosecution's concerns about re-traumatizing him. He wanted to tell his story, his mother said, wanted the jury to hear it from him. Emily watched as he was sworn in, as he sat in the witness box looking so small and vulnerable. Patricia sat in the front row, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming silently. Price questioned him gently, establishing the timeline of his abduction. Thomas's voice was quiet but steady as he described walking home from school, being approached by Margaret Chen, being offered cookies and a ride home because it looked like rain. "Did you know Mrs. Chun before that day?" Price asked. "Yes," Thomas said. "She volunteered at the book fair at my school. We talked about books. She was nice. She remembered what I liked." "What happened after you got in her car?" "She didn't take me home. She took me to her building, said she needed help carrying something from the basement. When we got down there, she pushed me inside and locked the door. The courtroom was absolutely silent." Thomas continued, describing the basement apartment, a single room with a mattress, a bucket for a bathroom, one dim bulb for light. He described the darkness when she turned off the light, the hunger when she withheld food, the cold in winter when she didn't run the heat. "She told me my mom didn't want me anymore," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "She said I was too much trouble, that's why Mom worked so much. She said I was safer with her, that she'd take care of me. She made me call her grandma." Price showed him photos of the basement apartment as the police had found it. Thomas identified his backpack in the corner, his clothes folded neatly on a shelf, books Margaret had given him. All fantasy novels about children who disappeared into other worlds. "Did Mrs. Chun ever hurt you physically?" Price asked. "She hit me sometimes, if I cried or made noise. And she—" Thomas paused, swallowing hard. "She cut my hair. I had long hair before, and she cut it all off, said I looked better this way. Like her son would have looked," she said. This was new information. Emily hadn't known Margaret ever had a son. But looking at the defendant, she saw something flicker in Margaret's expression. Pain, maybe, or memory. Rothstein's cross-examination was gentle, aware that attacking a child victim would alienate the jury. She focused instead on poking holes in his memory, suggesting his recollection might be unreliable after so long, that he couldn't be certain about specific details. Thomas held firm. He was certain. He remembered. When he stepped down, Patricia rushed to meet him, enfolding him in her arms. Mother and son clung to each other in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Emily turned away from their private moment, giving them space to grieve and heal. On the 5th day, Emily was called to testify. She'd prepared for this, practiced with Price, but nothing could really prepare her for walking up to the witness stand, for placing her hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. Price led her through the basics first: how long she'd known Margaret, the nature of their relationship, their daily interactions. Emily described the Margaret she'd known. Kind, attentive, generous with her time and attention. A good neighbor, a friend. "Did you ever suspect Mrs. Chun of criminal activity?" Price asked. "No," Emily said honestly. "Never. Not once." "Did she ever show inappropriate interest in children?" Emily thought about the book fair, about the journals detailing her observations of Maya. "She was interested in my work as a teacher. She'd ask about my students. At the time, I thought it was just normal conversation, but looking back," she paused. "She asked very specific questions. About which children were lonely, which ones had problems at home, which ones were struggling socially." "And you answered these questions?" Guilt crashed over Emily like a wave. "Yes, I thought she was just being caring, interested in my life. I told her about Thomas, about how he ate lunch alone, about how he loved books and fantasy. I gave her everything she needed to target him." Several jurors were watching her with sympathy, but Emily couldn't forgive herself so easily. She'd been the bridge between predator and prey, however unknowingly. Price moved on to the night of Margaret's arrest, to Emily's interactions with the police, to her shocked discovery of the truth. She painted Emily as another victim of Margaret's manipulation, a good person deceived by a master manipulator. Rothstein's cross-examination was less gentle with Emily than it had been with Thomas. She implied that Emily might have known more than she was admitting, that her close relationship with Margaret suggested possible complicity. The insinuation was subtle but clear. Maybe Emily had helped or at least turned a blind eye. You lived next door to Mrs. Chen for 2 years while Thomas Webb was in that basement, Rothstein said. Are you telling this jury you never heard anything? No sounds, no indication that a child was being held prisoner just 1 floor below you. The apartment was soundproofed, Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. And I had no reason to suspect anything. Margaret was my friend. Or so you thought, Rothstein said pointedly. But friendship can blind us to truth. Can't it, Miss Carter? We see what we want to see. It was a fair point and it struck home. Emily had been blind. She'd seen kindness where there was calculation, friendship where there was predation. She'd been so lonely after her divorce, so grateful for Margaret's attention, that she'd never questioned it. When Emily stepped down from the witness stand, her legs were shaking. She'd done her part, told her truth, but she felt no sense of relief, only exhaustion and an overwhelming sadness for all the ways she'd failed to protect the children in her care. The trial continued for 3 more weeks. Expert witnesses testified about Margaret's psychological state, diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits. They said, capable of mimicking emotion without feeling it, skilled at manipulation and deception. The kind of person who could keep a child in a basement while attending community meetings upstairs, feeling no cognitive dissonance between the 2 realities. The defense called their own experts who suggested Margaret might be suffering from dementia, that her memory of events might be compromised, that she couldn't have physically managed to maintain a captive for 17 months given her age and arthritis. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Margaret's physical capability, security footage showing her carrying heavy grocery bags, walking for miles through the neighborhood, climbing stairs without apparent difficulty. The arthritis, they suggested, was exaggerated, a convenient excuse. Margaret herself never testified. Rothstein advised against it, probably knowing that putting her client on the stand would be disastrous. Whatever mask Margaret wore in private life, it wouldn't hold up under prosecutorial questioning. The deliberation lasted 2 days. Emily wasn't in the courtroom when the verdict came down. She was teaching, trying to maintain some normalcy in her life, but Linda called her immediately after. Guilty, Linda said, on all counts. Emily sat down at her desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by a complicated mix of other emotions. Justice had been served, but it didn't undo the damage. It didn't give Thomas back his stolen childhood or erase the nightmares of the other victims. It didn't restore Emily's faith in her ability to judge character, to trust the people around her. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Emily attended, sitting once again in the gallery, watching as victim impact statements were read. Patricia spoke about her son's ongoing struggles, his fear of closed spaces, his difficulty trusting adults. Other parents spoke about their children's trauma, the long road to recovery, the ways their families had been forever changed. The judge, a stern woman named Judith Kowalski, listened to it all with a grave expression. When it was time to deliver the sentence, she looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Chen, she began, you have been convicted of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. The evidence presented at trial revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 15 years. You targeted vulnerable children, exploited their loneliness, and subjected them to psychological and physical abuse. You betrayed the trust of an entire community that believed you to be a kind and caring neighbor. Margaret sat motionless, her face blank. The law provides a maximum sentence of 25 years to life for your crimes. Judge Kowalski continued. Given your age, this effectively means you will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. Some might argue this is excessive for a 73-year-old woman. I disagree. Your age does not absolve you of responsibility for your actions. If anything, it makes them more reprehensible. You had 7 decades to learn empathy, compassion, basic human decency. Instead, you chose to become a predator. The judge sentenced Margaret to 25 years to life on each count, to be served consecutively. It was the harshest possible sentence, and it meant Margaret would die in prison. As the bailiff led Margaret away, she turned and looked back at the gallery. Her eyes found Emily's, and for just a moment, the blank expression cracked. Emily saw something underneath. Rage, maybe, or hurt, or some emotion she couldn't name. And then Margaret smiled. A small, secret smile that sent chills down Emily's spine. In that smile, Emily understood something she'd been trying to deny. Margaret wasn't sorry. She didn't feel remorse or regret. Whatever had driven her to do what she'd done, it was still there, unrepentant and unbroken. Prison wouldn't rehabilitate her. It would simply remove her from access to victims. After the sentencing, Patricia approached Emily in the hallway. They'd maintained a careful distance during the trial, but now something seemed to have shifted. "Thank you for testifying," Patricia said. "I know it wasn't easy." "I should have seen it," Emily said, the guilt rising again. "I should have protected him. You couldn't have known." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. She fooled everyone. The police, social workers, neighbors who'd known her for decades. "You can't carry that guilt, Emily. It'll destroy you." "How do you not hate me?" Emily asked, tears streaming down her face. "I was her friend. I gave her information about Thomas. I'm the reason she knew he was vulnerable." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I did hate you at first," she admitted. "When I found out how close you were to her, I wanted someone to blame besides her. But then I realized that's what she wanted. To divide us, to make us turn on each other instead of focusing on her. We can't let her win that way." She pulled Emily into a hug, and they stood together in the courthouse hallway, two women bound together by tragedy, trying to figure out how to move forward. "Thomas is in therapy," Patricia said when they pulled apart. "Good therapy with someone who specializes in trauma. He started talking about what happened, processing it. The nightmares are getting less frequent. It's going to be a long road, but he's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." Emily nodded, wanting desperately to believe it. That recovery was possible. That wounds could heal, even ones this deep. As she left the courthouse, Emily saw reporters waiting outside, cameras ready, hungry for a sound bite about how justice had been served. She pushed through them without comment, heading for the subway that would take her home. Home. The word felt strange. The apartment on Amsterdam Avenue didn't feel like home anymore. It felt contaminated, heavy with the memory of what had happened there, of who she'd been when she trusted Margaret Chen. But it was all she had. So she rode the train uptown, climbed the familiar stairs, unlocked her door, and stepped back into her life, such as it was. The succulent plant was still thriving on the windowsill, its leaves reaching toward the light. Emily had kept it despite everything, though she couldn't have explained why. Maybe because throwing it away felt like admitting defeat. Or maybe because it reminded her that life persisted, even in the darkest places. Even in basements where children were kept in darkness. Even in the aftermath of betrayal, life found a way to continue. She watered the plant, then stood at the window looking down at the street below. The oak tree was budding with early spring growth. Mr. Petrov walked past, carrying his groceries. A young family moved into the building across the street, the parents laughing as they struggled with boxes, while their toddler ran in circles around them. Life went on. The city continued its eternal rhythm. And somehow, Emily would have to find a way to continue too. 6 months after the sentencing, Emily stood in front of her class on the first day of the new school year. 30 faces looked back at her, a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The way 5th graders always looked on the first day. They didn't know who she was, what she'd been through. To them, she was just Miss Carter, their new teacher, someone to be sized up and categorized. Felt like a gift, that anonymity. The school year began like any other. Curriculum planning, getting to know students, establishing routines. But Emily found herself doing things differently. She paid closer attention to the quiet ones, the children who ate alone or struggled to make friends. Not with paranoia, but with intentional awareness. She created a buddy system, made sure no child was ever truly isolated. She held after-school art sessions and lunchtime reading clubs, creating spaces where different kinds of kids could connect. Principal Okonkwo noticed the changes. "You're doing good work," she told Emily in October, during a routine check-in. "The other teachers have commented on how inclusive your classroom feels." Emily didn't know how to explain that every lonely child reminded her of Thomas, that she saw Margaret's potential victims everywhere now and was determined to protect them in ways she hadn't protected him. So she just smiled and said, "I learned some hard lessons last year. I'm trying to do better." The community healing was slower and more complicated. The block association meetings, which Emily had helped organize for years, were strained now. People were wary of each other, questioning their own judgment, wondering what other secrets their neighbors might be hiding. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. But slowly, incrementally, they began to try. Mr. Petrov started a neighborhood watch program, not born of paranoia but of genuine community care. The young family across the street, the Johnsons, organized block parties, creating opportunities for people to reconnect. Emily helped where she could, though she was careful to maintain boundaries. She'd learned the cost of getting too close, too trusting. Maya was doing better. The nightmares had mostly stopped, replaced by a cautious resilience. She asked Emily sometimes about Grandma Maggie, trying to reconcile the woman she'd known with the woman who'd committed such terrible crimes. Was she always bad? Maya asked one night, curled up on the couch next to Emily. Or did something happen to make her that way? Emily didn't have a good answer. "I think people are complicated," she said carefully. "Sometimes they can be kind in some ways and cruel in others. Grandma Maggie did very bad things, and she's in prison now where she can't hurt anyone else. That's what matters." "Do you miss her?" Maya asked. The question hit Emily like a punch. Did she miss Margaret? The honest answer was yes, sometimes. She missed the version of Margaret she'd known, or thought she'd known. The woman who'd brought her soup, who'd listened to her problems, who'd made her feel less alone. That version had never really existed, but Emily mourned her anyway, mourned the friendship that had been a lie. "I miss who I thought she was," Emily told Maya. "But that person wasn't real. The real Margaret Chen is the person who hurt Thomas and those other children. That's who she always was." In November, Emily received a letter. The return address was the Women's Correctional Facility where Margaret was serving her sentence. Emily stared at it for 3 days before finally opening it. The letter was written in Margaret's neat cursive, the same handwriting Emily had seen on thank-you notes and grocery lists, and now, more horrifyingly, in journals detailing her stalking of children. "Dear Emily," it began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But I wanted you to know that our friendship was real, at least on my part. You were kind to me when I was lonely. You listened when I needed someone to talk to. That meant something. I know what I did was wrong. I know the children suffered. But you have to understand, I was trying to save them. The world is cruel to boys like Thomas, like the others. Sensitive, intelligent, different. I was giving them sanctuary, protecting them from a world that would have broken them anyway. My son would have been like them. He died before he was born, stillborn 30 years ago. I've spent every day since then imagining who he would have been, what kind of boy he would have grown into. When I saw Thomas, I saw my son. I couldn't let the world destroy him the way it destroys all the beautiful, broken things. I'm sorry that you're caught up in this. You deserved a better friend than me. Take care of yourself, Emily, and take care of Maya. Keep her close. The world is more dangerous than you know. Margaret." Emily read the letter 3 times, trying to process it. Was it an apology? A justification? An expression of genuine feeling, or just another manipulation? She would never know. Margaret's interior landscape was foreign to her, would always be foreign. The mind that could rationalize keeping children prisoner, that could convince itself that imprisonment was protection, was not a mind Emily could understand. She burned the letter in her kitchen sink, watching the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash. Then she called her therapist, Dr. Ramirez, and made an emergency appointment. "She's trying to get back into my head," Emily said during the session. "Even from prison, she's trying to maintain the connection." "And how do you feel about that?" Dr. Ramirez asked. Emily thought about it. "Angry," sad, confused, all of it at once. "Part of me still cares about her, even knowing what she is. That makes me feel guilty, like I'm betraying Thomas and the others. You can hold complicated feelings about someone, Dr. Ramirez said gently. You can acknowledge that she showed you kindness while also recognizing that kindness coexisted with cruelty. Human beings aren't simple. Even the worst of us contain multitudes. She said our friendship was real, Emily said. Do you think that's true? Does it matter? The question surprised Emily. Did it matter? Whether Margaret's feelings had been genuine or not, her actions had been monstrous. The friendship, real or false, had been built on a foundation of deception and predation. Couldn't be salvaged or redeemed. No, Emily said finally. I guess it doesn't. By December, something shifted in Emily's understanding of what had happened. She'd spent months focused on her own failure, her own blindness, her role as an unwitting accomplice. But slowly, with Dr. Ramirez's help, she began to see the situation differently. She hadn't failed Thomas. Margaret had deliberately targeted him, using skills honed over 15 years of predation. No individual person, no matter how vigilant, could have prevented what a systematic predator was determined to do. What Emily could do, what she was doing, was work to create systems that made it harder for predators to operate. She joined the board of a nonprofit focused on child safety, helping develop school programs that taught children about appropriate adult behavior, that gave them language to identify and report boundary violations. She worked with the school district to implement new protocols for volunteer screening, for monitoring adult-child interactions, for creating multiple overlapping layers of protection. One person couldn't watch everything, but a community working together could create a safety net. Thomas continued his recovery. Emily would see him sometimes, from a distance, walking to school with his mother or sitting in Riverside Park with a book. He'd grown taller, filled out a bit, started to look less like a victim and more like a regular kid. He still loved fantasy novels, Patricia told her during one of their occasional coffee meetings, but now he also loved astronomy, wanted to be an astrophysicist when he grew up. He talks about the future now, Patricia said, her eyes bright with cautious hope. For the longest time, he couldn't imagine tomorrow, couldn't see past the trauma. But lately, he talks about college, about the kind of work he wants to do. It's like he's coming back to himself. That's wonderful, Emily said, and meant it. He wanted me to tell you something, Patricia continued. He said it's not your fault, that you were nice to him and Miss Chun was nice to him, and niceness isn't the same as safety, but you couldn't have known that. He doesn't want you to feel guilty anymore. The forgiveness, offered through his mother, made Emily cry right there in the coffee shop. She'd carried so much guilt for so long that she'd forgotten it was possible to set it down. Spring came again, bringing renewal and growth. The oak tree outside Emily's window bloomed green, and the succulent plant on her windowsill sent up a flower stalk, tiny pink blooms opening toward the light. Emily found herself thinking less about Margaret, more about the future. She was dating someone new, a librarian named Marcus who was patient and kind and wonderfully, boringly normal. She wasn't ready for anything serious, might never be, but it felt good to be reminded that connection was possible, that not everyone wore masks. The anniversary of Margaret's arrest came and went quietly. There was a small news piece about it, a Where Are They Now segment that Emily refused to watch. She didn't need updates on Margaret's prison life. She didn't need to know if she'd found religion or joined a book club or continued to maintain her innocence. Margaret Chen was in the past. Emily's job was to focus on the present, on her students and her daughter and the community she was helping rebuild. One afternoon in May, Emily was walking home from school when she passed the building where Margaret's basement apartment had been. It had new tenants now, a young couple who'd converted it into a pottery studio. Through the window, Emily could see them working at their wheels, creating something beautiful from shapeless clay. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Even the darkest spaces could be reclaimed, transformed, filled with light and purpose. What had been a prison was now a place of creation. Emily continued home, feeling lighter than she had in months. The weight she'd been carrying hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, become more manageable. She was learning to live with what had happened, to integrate it into her story without letting it define her completely. At home, she found a letter in her mailbox. Not from Margaret this time, but from the mother of one of the other victims, a boy named David who'd been held for 3 months when he was 8. The letter thanked Emily for her work on child safety, said that David was doing well, was in therapy and making progress, wanted Emily to know that her advocacy mattered. Emily put the letter on her refrigerator, next to Maya's artwork and a photo of her class from last year. Reminders of why the work mattered, why she kept going even when it was hard. That evening, she stood at her window watching the sun set over Amsterdam Avenue, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The street was busy with life. Neighbors chatting on stoops, children playing ball. The eternal rhythm of the city continuing its ancient dance. Emily thought about the Thomas Webb she'd known, the quiet, bookish boy who'd loved fantasy and magic. And she thought about the Thomas Webb who existed now, scarred but surviving, learning to dream again, reaching toward a future that had almost been stolen from him. She thought about all the children she'd taught and would teach, all the lonely ones who needed someone to see them, to protect them, to help them believe they were valuable and worth saving. And she thought about herself, not as Margaret's dupe or Thomas's failed protector, but as someone who'd survived a different kind of trauma and chosen to transform it into purpose. The succulent plant bloomed on the windowsill, stubborn and alive. Emily had thought about throwing it away 1,000 times, but now she was glad she hadn't. It had survived neglect, survived being a gift from a monster, survived everything and continued to grow. Just like her, just like Thomas, just like all of them who'd been touched by Margaret Chen's darkness and chosen, somehow, to keep reaching for the light. 2 years later, the community center on 114th Street buzzed with activity on a Tuesday evening in October. Emily stood at the front of the room, looking at the 30 people gathered for the first meeting of the neighborhood safety initiative she'd helped found. It was a diverse group: parents, teachers, retirees, college students, all united by a commitment to creating safer spaces for children. "Thank you all for coming," Emily began. "I know everyone's busy, and giving up your Tuesday evenings is a big ask. But this work matters. What we're building here, a network of informed, watchful community members, can make a real difference." She outlined the program they developed: volunteer training in recognizing signs of child abuse and neglect, protocols for reporting concerns, coordination with local police and social services. It was practical, actionable, designed to empower ordinary people to protect the children in their communities. Thomas Webb sat in the 3rd row, next to his mother. At 14, he was tall and gangly, his voice cracking when he spoke. He'd volunteered to share his story tonight, to help others understand why this work mattered. When Emily called on him, he stood with the kind of composure that came from extensive therapy and hard-won healing. "Hi, I'm Thomas," he said. "Some of you might remember me from the news a few years ago. I was the kid who was taken by Margaret Chen, kept in her basement for 17 months. The room was completely silent. Everyone focused on this brave teenager who'd agreed to make himself vulnerable for the sake of others. "I'm not going to give you all the details," Thomas continued. "That's my story, and I get to decide how much to share. But I will tell you this: Ms. Chun was good at seeming normal. She fooled everyone. Teachers, neighbors, volunteers at my school. She knew how to make people trust her." He paused, gathering himself. "After I was rescued, I was angry at a lot of people. At my mom for working so much, at my teachers for not seeing I was struggling, at the neighbors who walked past that basement every day and never knew I was there. But eventually, I realized that wasn't fair. Ms. Chun was a professional at this. She'd been doing it for years. Nobody could have seen through her act because she'd perfected it." Patricia reached up and squeezed her son's hand, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "What would have helped," Thomas said, "is if there had been more people paying attention, not in a creepy, paranoid way, but in a caring way. If more adults had checked in on me, noticed when I was having a hard time, created safe spaces for me to talk about what I was feeling. Ms. Chun targeted lonely kids. If I'd been less lonely, maybe I wouldn't have been such an easy target." He sat down to respectful applause, and Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion. The boy who'd been too traumatized to speak for months after his rescue was now advocating for other children. It was a kind of miracle. After the meeting, As people mingled over coffee and cookies, Patricia approached Emily. "He wanted to do this," she said, answering the question in Emily's eyes. His therapist thought it might be empowering for him, turning his experience into advocacy. "He was incredible," Emily said. "So brave." "He learned from you," Patricia said, "watching you turn your guilt into action, building something positive from something terrible. It showed him that trauma doesn't have to define you, that you can use it as fuel for making change." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She'd never thought of herself as anyone's role model, especially not Thomas's. But maybe that was the point. Healing wasn't always deliberate or planned. Sometimes it happened in the margins, in small choices and quiet persistence. 4 years later, Maya Carter stood at her high school graduation, looking out at the crowd of families and friends. At 14, she was confident in a way her mother had never been at that age, clear-eyed and purposeful. She'd been through therapy, had processed her own complicated feelings about Margaret Chen, about trust and betrayal and the ways adults could fail children. Emily watched from the audience, flanked by Marcus, now her husband, the steady librarian who'd helped her believe in partnership again, and Daniel, who'd maintained friendly relations for Maya's sake. They'd become something like a family again, just in a different configuration. Maya's valedictory speech was about resilience and community, about the ways people could survive terrible things and choose to build something better. She didn't mention Margaret Chen by name, but Emily knew who she was thinking about, whose shadow informed every word. "We can't control what happens to us," Maya said, her voice strong and clear. "But we can control how we respond. We can choose to be bitter or better, to close down or open up, to isolate or connect. The world is scary sometimes, and people will let us down. But there are also good people everywhere, ready to help if we're brave enough to ask." After the ceremony, Emily hugged her daughter tight. This remarkable young woman who'd survived a close call with a predator and emerged with her hope intact. "I'm proud of you," Emily whispered. "I'm proud of us," Maya corrected. "We got through it together." 6 years later, the documentary filmmaker sat across from Emily in her classroom, camera trained on her face, asking questions Emily had answered dozens of times but still struggled with. "When you look back now," the filmmaker asked, "what do you wish you'd known then?" Emily thought about it carefully. "I wish I'd known that kindness isn't the same as safety, that people can be charming and dangerous at the same time, that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to." "Do you think you could have prevented what happened to Thomas?" "No," Emily said, with the certainty that came from years of therapy and reflection. "Margaret Chen was a skilled predator who'd been doing this for 15 years. But I think I could have made it harder for her. I could have been more aware of which children were isolated, more intentional about creating community. And that's what I've tried to do since. Create systems that make it harder for predators to find victims." The documentary, when it aired, was called Hidden in Plain Sight: The Margaret Chen Case. It was well done, Emily thought, watching it alone in her apartment. It contextualized Margaret's crimes within larger patterns of predation, explored the ways communities could better protect children, featured interviews with the victims and their families. Thomas appeared briefly, now 20 years old and a sophomore at MIT studying astrophysics. He talked about his recovery, about the long road back to feeling safe in the world, about how advocacy work had helped him reclaim his narrative. "I'm not just a victim," he said on camera. "I'm a survivor, an activist, a future scientist. What happened to me is part of my story, but it's not the whole story." The documentary ended with footage of the community center where Emily's safety initiative still met every Tuesday evening, showing children and parents learning together, creating the kind of watchful, caring community that could prevent future tragedies. 8 years later, Emily was 48 when Margaret Chen died in prison. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected despite Margaret's age. She got the news from Rodriguez, who'd retired from the force but still kept in touch occasionally. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, "before it hits the news." Emily sat with the information, trying to identify what she felt. Relief? Sadness? Anger that Margaret would never fully pay for her crimes, never reach true understanding of the harm she'd caused? Mostly, She felt tired. Tired of carrying this story, this connection to a woman who'd caused so much pain. Margaret's death meant the end of something. A final closing of a chapter Emily had been trying to finish for years. She didn't attend the funeral. There barely was one. Just a quiet burial with no mourners except the prison chaplain. Margaret had outlived her few relatives, and the community she'd once been part of wanted nothing to do with her remains. But Emily did something else. She took the succulent plant, now massive after 8 years of growth, sprawling across the windowsill in lush abundance, and she donated it to the community center. Let it live there, she thought, in a place dedicated to protection and healing. Let it be transformed from a gift from a monster into something that belonged to everyone, that represented survival and stubborn growth in the face of darkness. 10 years later, on the 10-year anniversary of Thomas Webb's rescue, the neighborhood held a commemoration. Not a celebration. What happened wasn't something to celebrate, but a recognition of how far they'd all come, how much they'd survived and rebuilt. Thomas flew in from California, where he was now working for NASA, studying exoplanets and the possibility of life beyond Earth. He'd gotten married the previous year to another scientist, a woman who knew his history and loved him anyway. They were expecting their first child, a daughter they planned to name Hope. "I wanted to be here," Thomas said, speaking to the crowd gathered in Riverside Park, near the spot where he disappeared all those years ago. "This place shaped me, for better and worse. And I wanted you all to know that I'm okay. More than okay. I have a good life, meaningful work, people I love. What happened to me was terrible, but it didn't destroy me." He paused, looking around at the familiar faces. Emily, Patricia, Mr. Petrov, now 94 and still sharp as a tack, the Johnsons and their now teenage children, dozens of others who'd searched for him, prayed for him, refused to give up hope. "You saved me," Thomas said simply. "Not just by finding me, but by being here afterward. By building programs to protect other kids. By refusing to let fear win. This community is different now, more aware, more connected, safer. That's the real legacy of what happened. Not the crime, but how we responded to it." Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, next to Maya, now 22 and studying social work, and Marcus. She thought about the Emily she'd been 10 years ago. Naive, trusting, unprepared for the darkness that could hide behind ordinary faces. That Emily was gone, replaced by someone harder but also more purposeful. Someone who understood that safety required vigilance but chose to remain open to connection despite the risks. The succulent plant from Margaret's gift had grown into dozens of plants now, propagated and shared throughout the community center, living in classrooms and offices and homes. People called them the survivor plants, these stubborn things that refused to die no matter how they were neglected or transplanted. They'd become a symbol of the community's resilience, of life's insistence on continuing even after trauma. As the sun set over Riverside Park, painting the Hudson River in shades of copper and gold, the crowd began to disperse. But Emily lingered, looking out at the water, thinking about the journey from that terrible October night to this moment of communal healing. She thought about Margaret Chen sometimes, tried to understand what had broken in her to make her capable of such calculated cruelty. But mostly, she thought about Thomas and the other survivors, about Maya and all the children who'd been protected by the systems they'd built, about the ordinary miracle of people choosing, again and again, to care for each other. Evil existed. Emily would never be naive about that again. But so did goodness, resilience, community, love. And in the end, those forces were stronger. They had to be, or none of this would be worth it. Emily turned away from the river and walked back toward Amsterdam Avenue, toward home. Marcus fell into step beside her, taking her hand without comment, offering his quiet presence. Behind them, the voices of the community, talking, laughing, remembering, healing, filled the October air. Life had continued, would continue. That was the real victory, Emily thought. Not that they'd survived Margaret Chen, though they had, but that they'd refused to let survival be the end of their story. They'd chosen to thrive, to build, to create something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. The night was cool and clear, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, Thomas would say, were planets circling distant suns, maybe harboring life that had survived its own catastrophes, its own monsters. The universe was vast and often cruel, but it was also filled with astonishing persistence, with life that refused to be extinguished. Emily climbed the stairs to her apartment, the same stairs she'd climbed thousands of times, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming, filled with photographs and books and the accumulated evidence of a life well lived despite everything. She stood at the window, the same window where she'd watched Margaret Chen's arrest 10 years ago, and looked down at the street below. The oak tree had grown taller, its branches reaching toward the sky. The block was quiet now, peaceful, full of sleeping families and warm lights in windows. And Emily understood, finally, what she'd been seeking all these years. Not to forget what had happened. Not to forgive the unforgivable. Not to return to the innocence she'd lost. Just to keep going. To wake up each morning and choose compassion over bitterness, connection over isolation, hope over despair. To teach her students, love her family, serve her community. To plant and water and tend, knowing that growth was always possible, even in the darkest soil. The succulent plants throughout the city continued to thrive, their leaves reaching toward light, stubborn and persistent and alive. Just like Emily, just like Thomas, just like all of them who'd survived Margaret Chen's darkness and refused to let it define them. In the morning, Emily would wake early and prepare for her students. She'd stop by the community center to check on the safety initiative. She'd have dinner with Maya and Marcus, ordinary moments that felt like miracles after everything they'd survived. But tonight, she simply stood at the window, watching her neighbors sleep, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future balanced delicately in her chest. It was enough. It had to be enough. The city hummed its eternal song outside her window, and Emily Carter, survivor and teacher, advocate and friend, allowed herself to rest. Subscribe to Unsolved Justice, where silence is never forgotten.